You have to understand, I wasn't scared at first. Not even a little. To me, it was just another assignment, a rung on the ladder. Field Report 734. A potential new strain of fungal blight on a corn farm in Iowa. For an agronomist fresh out of grad school like me, David Tran, this was a golden ticket. A chance to get my name on a paper, to prove that all those years staring into microscopes and memorizing Latin names for plant diseases actually meant something. The company gave me the keys to a brand new mobile lab van, a generous per diem, and a map that led to what felt like the middle of nowhere. I was confident. I was ready. The drive itself should have been a warning, I guess. Looking back, it's always like that, isn't it? You see the signs you missed. For the last hour, there was nothing but the road, a silver ribbon cutting through an ocean of gold. Corn, miles and miles of it, taller than my van, stretching right to the horizon on all sides. It wasn't beautiful, not in a postcard way. It was oppressive. The sky was huge and empty, and the silence was so complete that the hum of my engine felt like an intrusion. The GPS finally announced, "You have arrived," but all I saw was more corn and a narrow dirt track peeling off the main road. I took the turn, the van kicking up a cloud of dust that followed me like a ghost. After about a half mile, the sea of corn parted, and I saw it. The Miller place. It was exactly what you'd picture. A simple, two-story wooden farmhouse, its white paint peeling in the relentless sun. A big, red barn that looked ancient, and a smaller, padlocked shed next to it. A rusty pickup truck was parked near the porch. It was so still, the only sound was the wind, a constant, dry whisper rustling through a billion corn leaves. It sounded like a crowd whispering secrets you couldn't quite make out. I parked the van, killed the engine, and the silence rushed back in, even louder this time. I took a deep breath of the air. It smelled of dry earth, dust, and something else, something rich and loamy, almost metallic. I grabbed my clipboard and my case full of sample bags and headed for the house. Before I could even knock, the screen door creaked open. An old man stood there, silhouetted against the dark interior. He was lean, wiry, with skin tanned to the texture of old leather. "You the boy from the company?" he asked. His voice was gravelly, like stones rolling around in a bucket. "David Tran, sir," I said, offering a hand. "The agronomist. I spoke to you on the phone." He looked at my outstretched hand for a second before taking it. His grip was surprisingly strong, dry and calloused. "Miller, this here's my wife, Martha." A woman shuffled into view behind him. She was thin, with her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wiped her hands on her apron and gave me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was a brief, practiced motion, there and gone. "Welcome, Mr. Tran. It's a long drive out here." "Please, call me David," I said, trying to be friendly. "And yes, it is. You have quite the operation here, Mr. Miller." "It's not an operation," he said, staring past me at the fields. "It's a legacy. Been in the Miller family for 150 years. This land, it provides." There was a strange tone in his voice when he said that. A kind of reverence. It wasn't the pride of a businessman, it was the devotion of a true believer. Just then, I noticed a third figure standing in the shadows of the porch. A young man, probably my age, maybe a bit younger. He was tall and lanky, with the same dark hair as his father, but his face was pale and expressionless. He just stood there, holding a shovel, his eyes fixed on me. "And this is our son, Samuel," Mrs. Miller said, her voice a little too bright. Samuel didn't say anything. He just gave a slow, single nod, his gaze never wavering. It was unsettling. I've met shy people before, but this was different. It felt like I was being assessed, weighed, like a piece of livestock at auction. "Right," I said, clearing my throat. "Well, I'll just get my lab set up in the van. It's fully self-contained, I won't be a bother. Then, Mr. Miller, if you have some time, I'd like to walk the fields with you and start the initial interview. Go over your crop rotation, fertilizer logs, that sort of thing." "Logs," Mr. Miller scoffed softly, a dry little sound. "The land tells us what it needs. We listen." I gave a tight smile. "Okay, an old-timer. Set in his ways. I could work with that. Of course. But the company needs its data. Protocol, you know." He just grunted and gestured toward my van. "Do what you need to do, son. We'll be here." I spent the next hour in my element. The van was my sanctuary of science and order. I powered up the generator, calibrated the digital microscope, arranged my sterile containers, and laid out my testing kits. Everything had its place. The cool, conditioned air of the van was a relief from the oppressive heat outside. Through the window, I could see the corn, an endless, silent army standing guard. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of Samuel, walking slowly along the edge of the field, just walking, not really doing anything. It was weird. Finally, I was ready. I found Mr. Miller on the porch, sitting in a rocking chair, staring out at his kingdom. The interview started off normally enough, for the first 5 minutes anyway. So, I began, pen poised over my clipboard. The preliminary report mentioned a potential Cercospora leaf spot, but the photos were inconclusive. Have you noticed any specific lesions? Usually gray, rectangular, forming between the veins. Miller kept rocking, his eyes on the horizon. The leaves get sick sometimes. Then they get better. Right. And have you changed your nitrogen fertilizer mix in the last few seasons? Sometimes an imbalance can make the crop more susceptible. We don't use much of that chemical stuff. He cut me off. It poisons the soil, weakens it. Okay, I said, trying to stay patient. So you're running a mostly organic operation. That's great. What kind of organic fertilizers are you using? Manure? Compost? He stopped rocking. For the first time, he turned and looked directly at me. His eyes were pale blue, and in the harsh afternoon light, they seemed ancient and depthless. There was no hostility in them, just an unnerving certainty. Mr. Tran, he said, his voice low and serious. You city folk, you think you can understand everything by breaking it down into little numbers and charts. You think you can put the whole world into one of your bottles. I shifted uncomfortably. I'm just trying to diagnose a problem, sir. That's my job, to help you get a better yield, protect your investment. He let out a short, humorless laugh. He looked away from me again, back to the vast, rustling fields. The wind picked up, and the whispering sound grew louder, more insistent. This isn't an investment, he said. It's a covenant, a relationship. You have to give to get. You think all this, he made a sweeping gesture at the endless corn, comes from nothing? From a little water and sunshine? I was completely lost. This wasn't farming. It sounded like a sermon. I'm not sure I follow, Mr. Miller. He leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper. The folksy farmer persona was gone, replaced by something intense, something fervent. The land has its hungers, son. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and strange. The wind seemed to die down for a second, and the silence that followed was absolute. Its hungers? I repeated, feeling a prickle of unease on my neck. He nodded slowly, a grim finality in the movement. He looked out at the golden stalks, at the rich, dark soil visible between the rows. His expression was one of profound, unshakable faith. The land has its hungers, he said again. It's a living thing, strong, demanding. We just feed it what it asks for. And that was it. He stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. Walk the fields all you want. Take your samples. Samuel will show you the problem areas. He went inside, the screen door slamming shut behind him with a sharp crack that made me jump. I sat there for a long moment, my pen hovering over the blank questionnaire. I didn't write a single word. The sun was beginning to dip lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, but it brought no warmth. A chill had settled over me, a deep-seated strangeness I couldn't shake. Later that night, I was back in the van, the sterile white light of my lab pushing back the impenetrable darkness outside. The generator hummed, a lonely sound in the vast quiet. Every so often, the wind would gust, and the corn would rustle, a sound like dry bones rattling together. I had my samples, bags of soil, carefully clipped leaves, a few entire stalks with the root systems intact. I sat on my stool, looking out the window into the blackness where the fields were. I couldn't see the house. I couldn't see anything. I was alone in my little box of science, surrounded by a million silent witnesses. His words echoed in my head. The land has its hungers. We just feed it what it asks for. Feed it what it asks for. I muttered to myself, the sound of my own voice startling me. What the hell is that supposed to mean? It was crazy, the ramblings of an old farmer who'd spent too much time in the sun. It had to be. There was a rational, scientific explanation for the blight, and I was going to find it. I shook my head, trying to clear away the unease. I was a scientist. This was just data. I turned away from the window, pulled on a pair of latex gloves, and picked up the first stalk. It was time to get to work. Time to see what this land was really made of. I sat on my stool, the door of the van locked, the sterile white light of my lab pushing back the impenetrable darkness outside. The generator hummed, lonely, mechanical sound in the vast rural quiet. It was my anchor to sanity, a reminder of order and technology in a place that felt increasingly ancient and strange. I told myself Miller was just a weird old farmer, a man who'd spent too much time alone, talking to his crops until he started to believe they talked back. It was folklore, nothing more. My job was to cut through that folklore with a scalpel and a microscope. My job was to find the science. So, I got to it. Pulled on a fresh pair of latex gloves. The snap of the latex was a good, solid sound in the quiet van. It was the sound of procedure, of method. I laid out the plastic Ziploc bag labeled Specimen 1A, Stock Base, Root System. Inside, the severed cornstalk looked pathetic, its roots caked with a dark, rich Iowa soil. I could still smell it, even through the plastic, that loamy, almost metallic scent. I started with the visible symptoms, just like the textbook says. The leaves were a mess, sure. The expected lesions, the discoloration. Textbook stuff, really, nothing to write home about. The real question was in the roots. The report had mentioned a failure to thrive, a kind of systemic weakness that suggested the problem was coming from the ground up. I took the stock over to my small stainless steel sink and carefully rinsed the soil from the root ball. The water ran dark brown, then gray, as I worked the dirt loose with my gloved fingers. The roots that emerged were odd. They weren't withered or rotted, which is what you'd expect from a nutrient-sucking blight. They were thick, unusually turgid and a strange, deep red color, almost like raw meat. I noted it on my pad, abnormal coloration and density in root structure. Not consistent with typical necrosis or fungal decay. I was still in science mode. Still confident. This was just a new variable in the equation. Now for the microscope. This was my sanctuary. Under the lens, the universe made sense. There were rules. Cell walls, nuclei, cytoplasm. I took a sterile scalpel and shaved off a paper-thin cross-section from one of the thickest roots. I mounted it on a clean slide, added a drop of staining agent, and gently placed the cover slip on top. Routine. I'd done this 1,000 times. I clipped the slide into place under the lens of my Olympus and switched on the light. The bright, perfect circle illuminated the sample. I started at the lowest magnification, 40x. I squinted into the eyepiece. It was blurry at first. I adjusted the coarse focus knob, then the fine focus. The image swam into view. And I frowned. It didn't look right. The normal, orderly pattern of plant cells, those little hexagonal bricks of life, wasn't there. It looked jumbled, chaotic. The stain hadn't taken evenly, creating dark, dense patches and lighter, stringy areas. Contaminated sample, maybe, I muttered. Maybe I'd been sloppy rinsing it. I cranked the magnification up to 100x. The image jumped, expanding to fill my view. My breath caught in my throat. This was no contamination. This wasn't right at all. Where I expected to see the clear, defined walls of plant cells, I saw fibers. A dense, interwoven mat of fibers. They were packed together in tight bundles, running parallel to each other. They were thick, striated. I've spent years looking at plant tissue. Xylem, phloem, parenchyma. I know what it looks like. This wasn't it. This was something else entirely. Something alien. My heart started to beat a little faster. Okay, David, stay calm. Think, what could cause a mutation like this? Some kind of crazy horizontal gene transfer from a bacterium? A virus that completely rewrites cellular structure? It was wildly improbable, but not strictly impossible. I was still trying to fit it into a box I understood. I reached for the knob and cranked the magnification to its maximum, 400x. The world inside the eyepiece swelled again, becoming a landscape of bizarre, organic topology. And that's when I saw it. That's when the foundation of my scientific world cracked right down the middle. The fibers, they weren't just fibers. I could see the individual striations now, the bands of light and dark along their length. They were bundled together into fascicles, wrapped in a thin membrane. It was a structure I knew intimately, but one that had absolutely no business being here. My brain was screaming a word at me, a word that didn't belong. A word from a different textbook, from a different kingdom of life. Myofibrils. I was looking at muscle tissue. I physically recoiled from the microscope, my stool scraping loudly against the van's vinyl floor. The sound was shocking in the silence. I stared at the innocuous-looking machine, my own reflection a pale, wide-eyed ghost on its black metal body. No, I whispered, no way, it had to be a mistake, a hallucination, exhaustion from the long drive, the old man's weird sermon getting into my head. I took a deep breath, the air in the van suddenly feeling thin and used up. I rubbed my eyes hard, trying to reset my brain. I was a scientist. Scientists don't see muscle tissue inside a cornstalk. I forced myself back onto the stool. My hand was shaking slightly as I reached for the focus knob again. I looked back into the eyepiece, praying I had imagined it. But it was still there. That impossible, terrifying truth. A microscopic, perfectly formed bundle of muscle fibers where plant cells should be. And as I stared, holding my breath, my blood running cold, I saw something else. It was a flicker, the barest hint of movement. A tiny, rhythmic contraction in one of the fiber bundles. A pulse. Thump thump. It was so small I thought I'd imagined it. A trick of the light, an eye float. But I kept staring, my focus absolute, my world shrinking to that single, illuminated circle. Thump thump. It happened again. A slow, uterine pulse. A living thing. I saw it. I know I saw it. A piece of a corn root, severed from the plant, sitting dead on a glass slide under a hot lamp, and it was flexing. I ripped my eye away from the scope and shoved my chair back so hard it tipped over with a crash. I scrambled to my feet, backing away until my back hit the cool metal wall of the van. I was breathing hard, my chest tight. I stared at the microscope as if it were a venomous snake. This was not in any book I had ever read. This was not in any database I had ever consulted. This broke the rules, all of them, the fundamental, bedrock rules of biology that separate a plant from an animal. My mind raced, trying to find a rational handhold. My training kicked in, a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos. I spun around and grabbed my laptop, my fingers fumbling on the keys. I typed in search terms, my mind a frantic blur. Plant cell transmutation, viral myogenesis in flora, abnormal protein structures in Z. maize roots. The results were what I knew they would be. Articles about galls, about tumors, about normal fungal infections. Scientific papers on crop diseases. Nothing, absolutely nothing remotely close to what I had just seen. The global, collective knowledge of humankind had no category for this. The hum of the generator suddenly sounded menacing. The gentle, whispering rustle of the corn outside was no longer a secret. It was a threat, a million voices, a million witnesses to something I couldn't comprehend. Miller's words echoed in my head, no longer the ramblings of a crazy old man, but a dire warning I hadn't been equipped to understand. The land has its hungers. We just feed it what it asks for. I sank down onto the floor, my back against the wall, my laptop forgotten on the counter. The neat, sterile world of my lab on wheels felt like a cage now, a flimsy box of logic floating in an ocean of impossible horror. The confidence, the ambition, the scientific certainty I'd arrived with, it had all evaporated in the light of that microscope. It was all a joke. I sat there for a long time, just listening to my own ragged breathing and the sound of the wind in the corn. Slowly, I lifted my head. My gaze fell on the other sample bags lined up on the counter. The clippings of leaves, and the bag of soil. Dark, rich, heavy-looking soil. A cold dread, far deeper and more primal than mere scientific confusion, seeped into my bones. The question I was sent here to answer, what is wrong with the corn, was gone. It had been replaced by a new one. A much more fundamental and terrifying question that bloomed in the dark, silent corners of my mind. If the roots of the corn were no longer plant, but flesh, what in God's name were they feeding on? The floor was cold. That's the first thing I remember clearly after the pulsing. My back was pressed against the van's thin metal wall, and I could feel the faint vibration of the generator through it. A low thrum that seemed to be vibrating in time with the impossible beat I'd seen under the microscope. I was a scientist, a man of data, of observable facts, of peer-reviewed papers and established biological laws. And in the space of about 30 seconds, my entire universe of knowledge had been revealed as a child's bedtime story. Useless, quaint, dangerously incomplete. My mind was a high-speed car crash. Images flashed behind my eyes, the striated fibers, the thick, meaty roots, the calm, placid face of Old Man Miller. The land has its hungers. We just feed it what it asks for. The words weren't a farmer's proverb anymore. They were a confession. For a long time, I just sat there, The question I'd ended with hung in the silent, sterile air of the van, a toxic gas with no place to go. If the roots were flesh, what were they feeding on? The air felt thin. I was breathing, but I wasn't getting enough oxygen. My training, the disciplined part of my brain that had gotten me through exams and difficult research projects, was screaming at me to do something. To impose order, to collect more data. It was a desperate, primal urge to find a box, any box, to put this horror into. Slowly, like an old man, I pushed myself to my feet. My legs felt unsteady. I looked over at the counter. The microscope stood there, an innocent-looking oracle that had just pronounced a death sentence on my sanity. Next to it, lined up like evidence in a trial, were the other sample bags. And then I saw it. The bag of soil, labeled Specimen 2A, base soil. Soil, the foundation, the source. My hands were shaking, but I found a strange calm in having a task. Procedure was a shield. I pulled on a new pair of latex gloves. The snap echoed in the van. Louder this time. I took the bag of soil, a heavy block of dark, rich earth, and emptied a portion of it into a sterile analysis tray. It looked normal. It smelled normal, that earthy, slightly metallic scent of fertile ground. But I just knew, that it wasn't. What do you test for when you don't know what you're looking for? You start broad. I ran a basic composition analysis first. I loaded a small, prepared sample into the centrifuge, then into the preliminary chemical analyzer. It was a machine I could operate in my sleep. Something to do with my hands. Something to focus on besides the image of that pulsing tissue. I sat on the stool, staring at the small monitor as the machine did its work. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a one-off mutation. A single, freakish plant. Maybe I was exhausted, hallucinating. Maybe the sample was contaminated with something from a nearby slaughterhouse, a runoff that caused this bizarre mimicry. My mind scrambled for explanations, each one flimsier than the last. The machine beeped. The initial results popped up on the screen. A list of elements and compounds. I scanned down the list. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, all the usual suspects. And then I saw it. Iron, Fe, concentration abnormally high. Organic protein compound, concentration abnormally high. My heart gave a painful thud. High iron and high protein. I thought of blood meal. Bone meal. It was a type of organic fertilizer. A bit old-fashioned, a bit messy, but not unheard of. Some organic farmers used it. It was a plausible explanation. I clung to it like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. Okay, so the Millers were using some kind of supercharged, homemade blood fertilizer. It was affecting the plant's biology, causing some kind of cellular misidentification. It was a theory. It was thin. It didn't explain the muscle fibers, but it was science. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a monster, but it didn't feel right. The dread in my gut didn't go away. The concentration levels were off the charts, far higher than any commercial or homemade fertilizer I'd ever seen documented. And it didn't explain the structure. The perfectly formed myofibrils. I had one more tool at my disposal. The best one I had. A portable mass spectrometer. It could break down complex compounds and identify them with pinpoint accuracy. It was overkill for a soil test. It was what you used for contaminant tracing or delicate molecular research. Tonight, it was my last line of defense against the abyss. I prepared another sample, a more involved process. It took me nearly an hour, my hands working with a slow, deliberate precision that felt detached from the panic churning inside me. I loaded the sample into the spectrometer. The machine whirred to life, its internal pumps kicking in. A progress bar appeared on my laptop screen, connected via Bluetooth, 0%. I sat there and waited. The only sound was the hum of the machine and the relentless, whispering rustle of the corn outside. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. I kept my eyes glued to the screen, watching the bar crawl. 10%, 25%, 50%. My mind kept replaying Miller's words. We just feed it what it asks for. Who was we? Him and his wife? And that quiet, strange son of his, Samuel? The boy I'd barely seen, who seemed to fade into the background like old wallpaper. 75%. The machine was cross-referencing the identified molecular structures against a massive database, everything from known minerals to complex organic proteins. It would find an answer. It had to. 90%, 95%, 99%. Complete. The screen refreshed, displaying the full analysis. It was a long list of data, chemical formulas, and molecular weights. I scrolled down, past the minerals, past the simple organic matter. My eyes were looking for the protein. The big one, the one that explained the iron. And then I found it. It wasn't a long, complicated scientific name. It wasn't a formula. It was a single line of cold, black, digital text. A result so clean, so unambiguous, it stole the air from my lungs. Identified high-mass compound, hemoglobin. Cross-reference analysis, positive match. Source species profile, Homo sapiens. I think I stopped breathing. I read the words again. And again. The letters didn't change. Homo sapiens. Human. The screen glowed in the dark van, illuminating my face. It wasn't blood meal from a cow or a pig. It was human blood, not just blood. Hemoglobin, the very protein that carries oxygen in our veins. It was in the soil. It was the fertilizer. The corn was eating people. The theory about a weird fertilizer didn't just break. It shattered into a million pieces, and in its place was a reality so monstrous I felt my gorge rise. I stumbled back, knocking my chair over again, and lurched to the small sink, dry heaving. Nothing came up. There was only a cold, hollow emptiness in my stomach. I splashed water on my face. The person looking back at me from the small, polished steel sink was a stranger. His eyes were wide with a terror that was no longer academic. This was real. I was standing in a box surrounded by a graveyard that was also a garden. The missing persons reports I'd half-joked about on the drive here, they weren't jokes. They were ingredients. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that line of text on the screen. Homo sapiens. I turned off the bright lab lights, plunging the van into darkness save for the dim power light on my laptop. The generator was off now. I didn't want the noise. I wanted to hear. The silence was absolute for a moment, and then the sounds of the night crept in. The chirp of a cricket. The low rustle of the wind. That damn corn, whispering. I sat in the driver's seat, peering out the windshield into the vast, inky blackness. The moon was a pale sliver, offering little light. The farmhouse was dark, and then I saw movement. A flicker of motion near the farmhouse porch. A small silhouette detached itself from the shadows. It was too small to be Mr. or Mrs. Miller. It was Samuel, the boy. He moved with a quiet, sure-footed familiarity, not towards the path, but straight into the dense rows of corn. He disappeared into the darkness. My heart was hammering against my ribs. What was he doing out there? I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out my bird-watching binoculars. They were powerful, maybe too powerful. I wasn't sure I wanted to see. But I had to. I had to know. I propped my elbows on the steering wheel to steady my shaking hands and raised the binoculars to my eyes. I scanned the dark ocean of corn, searching. It took a minute, but then I found him. He had walked about 50 yards into the field and stopped. The circle of my vision framed him perfectly. He just stood there for a moment, a small, still figure surrounded by the towering stalks. And then he did something that made the hair on my arms stand up. He knelt down in the dirt, slow and deliberate, like a parishioner entering a pew. He bowed his head. I adjusted the focus, my knuckles white on the plastic housing of the binoculars. I could see the back of his head, his thin shoulders. He reached out and touched a stalk of corn, a gesture that was almost tender. Then he leaned forward, pressing his ear to the ground. He stayed like that, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. I was holding my breath, my own ears straining as if I could somehow hear what he was hearing. He was listening to the earth, to the hunger, and then his lips started to move. I couldn't hear a thing, of course, but I could see the movement. A soft, rhythmic whispering. He was talking to it. He was having a conversation with the soil, a quiet, intimate, one-sided dialogue with the monster beneath his knees. The sight was so profoundly wrong, so deeply unsettling, it felt like a violation of some natural law. It was a prayer, a feeding, an act of obscene worship. He stayed there for maybe 10 minutes, whispering to the dirt. Then, just as slowly, he stood up, brushed the soil from his knees, and walked back towards the house, melting back into the shadows he'd emerged from. I lowered the binoculars, my hands slick with sweat. The scientific part of my brain was gone. It had fled, leaving only a raw, primal fear. The Millers weren't just farmers. They were keepers, priests of some ancient, bloodthirsty god made of dirt and roots. And their sun was its acolyte. The next morning, the sun rose with a kind of cheerful indifference that felt like a personal insult. I hadn't slept. I stayed in that driver's seat all night, watching the dark, silent field. When I saw Mr. Miller emerge onto the porch for his morning coffee, I forced myself into motion. I had to act normal. I grabbed a soil probe and some sample bags, putting on the mask of the diligent agronomist. "Morning, Mr. Miller," I called out, my voice sounding hollow and fake to my own ears. "Just heading out to grab a few more control samples from the western edge." He nodded, sipping his coffee. "You do what you need to do, son." His eyes lingered on me for a second too long. There was no warmth in them. I walked down the path, but I didn't go to the western edge. My feet carried me, as if on their own, towards the spot in the field where I'd seen Samuel. I counted the rows, paced out the distance. I found the place easily. And I stopped dead. The rest of the corn in this section was showing the same signs of blight, the yellowing leaves, the slight wilting. But here, in a small, distinct circle about 10 feet in diameter, the plants were different. They were a vibrant, healthy green. The stalks stood thicker, taller. The leaves were broader, fuller, reaching for the sun with a vigor the surrounding plants lacked. It was an oasis of unnatural life in a field of decay. My blood ran cold. I knelt down, just as Samuel had. The air was still. I looked at the ground beneath the healthy plants. The soil was darker here, richer, and it was still faintly damp, despite the morning sun, as if it had been recently and very precisely watered. I reached out a hesitant, gloved finger and touched the surface. It was cool and slightly packed. As I pulled my finger back, a faint, dark red smear came away on the latex. I brought it to my nose. There was no mistaking the smell. Faint, but sharp, coppery and metallic. The smell of rust. The smell of blood. I stood up from where I'd been kneeling, my own knees now dusted with that dark, unnaturally rich soil. The smear on my glove wasn't a theory. It wasn't a data point to be analyzed. It was a statement, a conclusion. The coppery smell clung to the air, sharp and undeniable. It was the smell of a fresh wound. Walking back to the van, I felt a strange new clarity. The scientific part of my brain, the part that had been scrambling for rational explanations, had finally gone quiet. It was like a loud, obnoxious guest had finally left the party, and in the silence, I could hear what the rest of my mind, the older, more primal part, had been screaming all along. This wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a situation to be survived. The facts were simple now, stripped of all their academic complexity. The soil was fed with people. The corn grew from that soil. The Millers were the farmers. I wasn't an agronomist here to study a blight. I was a guest in an abattoir, sleeping in my little metal box in the middle of a predator's hunting ground. I realized with a sudden, gut-twisting lurch, just another potential crop. My hands felt cold. I looked at them, half expecting to see dirt under the nails, but they were clean inside the latex gloves. I stripped them off and threw them in the biohazard bag, a useless gesture of sterile procedure in a world that was anything but. I had to get more proof. Not for myself, I was convinced. I needed proof for someone else. For the police. For anyone who would listen. The soil samples and the data on my laptop were one thing, but they were abstract. I needed something tangible, something human, something that couldn't be explained away as a fertilizer anomaly. My eyes scanned the farmstead, the house, the neatly kept porch, the smaller barn where they kept the modern tractor. And then, further back, set away from everything else, was the other one. A big, old barn, its wood weathered to a splintery gray, its roof sagging in the middle like a tired old man's back. I'd noticed it before, of course, but I hadn't paid it much mind. It was clearly disused, but now, looking at it, I realized something. I had never seen any of the Millers go near it. Not once. It sat there, ignored and isolated, and a heavy-looking, rust-pitted padlock was looped through its main hasp. Why lock a derelict building? What was in there that was worth protecting? Or, a colder thought whispered, what was in there that was meant to be hidden? That became my focus, my obsession for the rest of the morning. I stayed in the van, pretending to work, my laptop open to a spreadsheet of meaningless data. Every few minutes, I'd glance out the window at that gray, silent structure. It was my only lead, the only place on this entire, sprawling property that felt out of place, that felt like it held a secret. The opportunity came around noon. The old Ford truck rumbled to life, coughing out a plume of blue smoke. I watched as Mr. Miller, wearing a clean shirt for a change, got into the driver's seat. His wife, carrying a large straw bag, came out and joined him. Even Samuel was with them, sitting silently in the middle of the bench seat, a small ghost between his parents. Mr. Miller leaned his head out the window as he passed the van. "Heading into town, David," he called out. His voice was casual, friendly. It made my skin crawl. "Need to pick up some supplies. Should be gone a couple of hours. You just make yourself at home." I gave a wave, forcing a smile that felt like it was going to crack my face. "Sounds good, Mr. Miller." "No problem." I watched the truck drive down the long dirt path, kicking up a cloud of dust until it turned onto the main county road and disappeared behind a stand of trees. The silence it left behind was huge. It was just me, the whispering corn, and that locked barn. I didn't wait. I didn't give myself time to second guess it. Every second was borrowed time. I went to the back of the van, to my main tool chest. Under a pile of wrenches and geological hammers was a set of bolt cutters. They were heavy, oiled, and brutally efficient. I'd bought them to cut through old fencing if I ever got stuck on a back road. Now, they felt like the most important tool I owned. My heart was a drum against my ribs as I walked across the yard. The sun was high and hot, beating down on my neck. The world felt too quiet, too open. I felt exposed, like an actor on a brightly lit stage. Every step crunched in the gravel. I kept glancing back towards the road, half expecting to see the Ford truck reappear. I reached the barn. Up close, it was even more dilapidated. Gaps between the warped wooden slats let thin slivers of light into the gloom within. The smell was the first thing that hit me. Not the usual barn smell of old hay and manure. This was different. It was a thick, cloying smell of rust and decay, with a foul, vaguely sweet undertone that reminded me of meat left out too long in the sun. The padlock was as big and old as it looked. I positioned the jaws of the bolt cutters around the shackle. My hands were shaking. I had to put the tool down, wipe my sweaty palms on my jeans, and try again. I squeezed the handles together. The metal of the cutters groaned. For a second, nothing happened. I repositioned and squeezed again, putting my entire body weight into it. Snap! The sound was shockingly loud in the silence. It echoed across the farmyard. The two halves of the shackle fell away, and the lock swung uselessly on its hasp. I froze, listening, my breath held tight in my chest. Nothing, just the wind. Slowly, I pulled the heavy wooden doors open. They scraped and groaned against the dirt floor, protesting the movement. The darkness inside was almost total, a stark contrast to the bright sun. The air was thick and hard to breathe, full of dust and that awful smell. As my eyes adjusted, shapes began to resolve themselves in the gloom. It was mostly empty. Old, rotted hay bales were slumped against one wall, looking like sleeping beasts. And hanging from wooden pegs or leaning against the walls were tools. Not the new, well-maintained tools from the other barn. These were ancient, scythes with long, curved blades, a heavy, broad-headed wood axe, pitchforks and shovels, all with wooden handles worn smooth by a century of use. But they weren't just old. They were dirty, coated in something dark. I walked closer to a shovel leaning against a post. In a sliver of light from a crack in the wall, I could see the caked-on grime. It wasn't mud. It was darker, flakier in some places, almost like tar in others. It was the same dark brown, almost black, substance that stained the far too fertile soil. The smell of rust was stronger here. The smell of old blood. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. This was a place of work. A place of processing. My gaze swept the cavernous space. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a stack of rotted pallets, was a large, heavy canvas tarp. It was thrown over a lumpy, irregular shape. This was it. This had to be it. My feet felt like lead as I crossed the dirt floor. Every instinct was telling me to turn around, to get in the van and just drive until I ran out of gas. But I knew I couldn't. I needed to see. I grabbed a corner of the tarp. It was stiff and heavy with grime. I pulled. It came away with a dusty sigh, revealing what was beneath. My mind just stopped. It refused, for a full second, to process what I was seeing. It wasn't one thing. It was a pile, a heap of last moments. There were backpacks, the kind hikers or students would use, their fabric faded and torn. A single hiking boot, its laces still tied. A small mound of cell phones, each one with a shattered screen, their internal components glinting. And wallets, a half dozen of them, at least, tossed into the pile, some of them open, exposing empty slots where cash and cards used to be. I fell to my knees. The sickness rose in my throat, hot and acidic. This was a tomb, a collection of trophies. These weren't just items, they were people. They were the fertilizer, the source of the iron and protein, the source of the hemoglobin that was feeding the corn. My shaking hand reached out, brushing against a wallet lying on top. It flipped open. A driver's license was still tucked into the clear plastic window. The picture was of a young woman with a bright, hopeful smile and blonde hair. The plastic was faded and scratched, but the face was clear enough. And I knew that face. I had seen it on a missing poster pinned to a bulletin board in a gas station halfway here. I'd seen it on a local news report online when I was doing my initial prep for this trip. I picked it up. The plastic felt cold. The name was printed clearly under the state seal. Jessica Albright, age, 19, eyes, blue. I remembered the news story. A college student from Des Moines went hiking in a state park about 50 miles from here 2 years ago and never came back. Her car was found abandoned at the trailhead. They searched for weeks. They never found a thing. Until now, she was here. She was in the dirt. She was in the roots, in the leaves, in the golden ears of corn that rustled just outside this horrible building. The smile in the photo was the most terrible thing I had ever seen. The hope in it. I dropped the license as if it had burned me. I scrambled back, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. I had to get out. I had to get out and run. My mind was finally working again, a frantic, screaming alarm. Proof. I had my proof. I had to get to the van. Get my laptop. Get the license. Get the hell out of here. I was halfway to my feet, my body trembling, my eyes locked on the open barn doors and the bright, safe daylight beyond them. And then I heard it. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. A low, familiar rumble. My blood turned to ice. It couldn't be. Not yet. It had barely been an hour. They weren't supposed to be back. The trip to town, the supplies, it was a lie. It was a test. They wanted to see what I would do. The rumble grew closer, then stopped. A moment of dead silence. Then the unmistakable, solid thump of a heavy truck door slamming shut. I was in the shed. The door was wide open. And they were home. For a second, there was no thought. Just sound. A sound that traveled straight from my ears to my stomach and twisted everything into a cold, hard knot. The solid, final thump of the truck door. It wasn't an angry slam. It was simple, functional, the sound of someone arriving home, their workday over. Or just beginning. My blood felt like it had turned to slush. They were back. An hour. They said a couple of hours. The lie was so casual, so easy. It was a net, and I had just swum right into it. I was in their slaughterhouse, the doors wide open, a pile of human remains at my feet. The bright rectangle of daylight in the barn doorway, which had seemed like a path to safety a minute ago, now felt like a spotlight on a stage. My mind started working again, but it wasn't the calm, methodical mind of a scientist. It was a panicked animal's mind, a squirrel caught in the middle of a road. Hide, run, fight. The commands were all screaming at once, a useless jumble of instinct. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, crab walking away from the pile of wallets and backpacks, my eyes pinned to the doorway. The dirt floor was cold and gritty under my palms. I forced myself to stop, to breathe. Panicking was death. Moving without thinking was death. I had to be quiet. I had to be invisible. I could hear their voices now, distant, muffled. A man's low murmur, "Mr. Miller." It wasn't angry, just conversational. That was somehow worse. It meant this was normal for them. This was just another Tuesday. My eyes darted around the dark interior of the barn. There was nowhere to go. No back exit, no loft to climb into. Just old tools and rotting hay. The only way out was the way I came in. Past them. Proof. The thought flickered, weak but persistent. The driver's license. Jessica Albright's smiling face. If I died here, someone had to know why. Someone had to find this place. My hand shot out and snatched it from the dirt. The plastic felt slick and wrong in my sweaty hand. I shoved it deep into the front pocket of my jeans. I crept to the edge of the doorway, pressing my back against the splintery wood of the barn wall. My heart was a wild, frantic drum against my ribs. I risked a look, peering through a crack between two warped planks. I could see the yard. The Ford truck was parked right where it had been before, near the porch. But they weren't on the porch. Where were they? My eyes scanned the area, desperately trying to locate them. Nothing. The silence stretched, thin and tight. Maybe they went inside the house? Maybe I had a chance. A few seconds. That's all I would need. It was a stupid hope, and I knew it, but it was the only hope I had. Okay, I laid out the plan in my head, a frantic, one-sentence strategy. Run to the van, get in, start it, and drive. Don't look back, don't hesitate, just go. I took a deep breath, held it, and burst from the cover of the barn. The sprint across the gravel yard was the longest 50 feet of my life. The world seemed to slow down, each crunch of my work boots a deafening crackle. The sun was blindingly bright. I kept my eyes locked on my van, the white metal box that was my only chance of getting out of this nightmare. I fumbled for the keys in my pocket, my fingers clumsy and numb. I half expected to hear a shout, to feel a hand grab my shoulder, to hear the shriek of a blade. But there was nothing, just the whisper of the wind through the corn. I reached the driver's side door, jammed the key into the lock, and wrenched it open. I threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me. Safe. For a second, I felt a wave of impossible relief. I was in my bubble of steel and glass. I was safe. I shoved the key into the ignition, my hands shaking so badly it took 2 tries. Come on, come on, come on, I whispered, the words a desperate prayer. I twisted the key, the engine turned over, it coughed, a weak, sputtering sound. Then it whined, and then it died. A cold dread, heavier and deeper than anything I'd felt before, washed over me. No, not now, not like this. I tried again, the same thing, a pathetic whirring sound from the starter motor, but no life. The battery was fine, the lights on the dash were on. It wasn't the engine. I leaned my head out the open window, my eyes going straight to the front tire. And I saw it. It wasn't flat in the normal way. It was slashed, a deep, wide gash in the sidewall, a gaping black mouth smiling up at me. It was a precise, deliberate wound. They knew, they had known all along I was in the barn. They hadn't gone inside the house. They had been waiting. They had been disabling my escape. As if on cue, a single, harsh light flickered on. The porch light. It cut through the growing twilight, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard. And there they were. They emerged from the front door of the house, not as a family, but as a procession. A silent, purposeful unit. Mr. Miller was first. He wasn't wearing his friendly, folksy smile anymore. His face was a blank mask, his eyes dark and empty. In his right hand, he held a sickle. It wasn't one of the ancient, rusted ones from the barn. This one was sharp, its curved blade gleaming under the porch light. He held it casually, like a farmer holding his favorite tool. Behind him came his wife. Her arms were crossed over her chest, and her head was tilted slightly to the side. And she was humming. It was a low, tuneless sound, a droning melody that had no beginning and no end. It wasn't a lullaby, it was the sound an insect makes, mindless and persistent. It was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. And last came Samuel, the quiet boy. He walked to the front of my van and just stood there, blocking any possible path forward. He was holding a shovel, gripping its long wooden handle with both hands. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the ground in front of the van, as if he was deciding where to start digging. They took their positions and just waited. It was a performance, a ritual, and I was the star. Mr. Miller took a slow step forward, the gravel crunching under his boots. He stopped about 10 feet from my door. He raised his head and looked at me, right through the glass. There was no anger in his eyes. There was no emotion at all. There was just a flat, patient hunger. Time for planting, son, he said. His voice was calm, reasonable. The voice he used to talk about the weather. The soil is hungry. My brain finally snapped. The last piece of rational thought, the last vestige of the scientist trying to analyze an anomaly, shattered into a million pieces. This wasn't a blight. It wasn't a fungus. It was this. Them. This hunger. My eyes darted around the inside of the van. A cage. A metal box. They could break the windows. They could pull me out. The shovel, the sickle. I could see it happening. A flash of silver, a dull thud. Me, becoming part of the fertilizer anomaly. My gaze fell on the passenger seat, on the clutter of my gear. Maps, sample bags, a GPS unit. And underneath it all, the bright orange fabric of my emergency kit. I'd packed it as an afterthought. It was standard procedure for remote fieldwork. Flares, first aid, a space blanket, water purification tablets. Things you pack hoping you never have to use them. The flare gun. My hand lunged for the kit, tearing at the zipper. My fingers closed around the hard plastic grip of the gun. It was small, almost a toy, bright orange and ridiculously simple. I grabbed one of the red flare cartridges. My hands were slick with sweat, and I almost dropped it. I finally managed to break the gun open, shove the cartridge into the chamber, and snap it shut. It felt impossibly heavy. Mr. Miller took another step forward. Mrs. Miller's humming got a little louder. I didn't think. There was no time to think. I kicked my door open, using it as a shield. I leaned out, my body trembling uncontrollably. I wasn't aiming at them. That would be useless. A flare gun isn't a weapon. It's a signal, a call for help, but it's also fire. My eyes found their target. Not the house, not the Millers. The corn. The tall, dry stalks stood just yards away from the van, a golden brown wall that stretched into the darkness. It had been a dry couple of weeks. The stalks were like tinder. "Get back," I screamed, my voice cracking, a pathetic squeak against the vast silence. Mr. Miller just smiled, a thin, tight smile. "The earth provides," he said softly. I raised the gun, pointed it at the heart of the cornfield, and pulled the trigger. There was a loud pop and a whoosh of air. A brilliant red comet shot from the barrel, trailing smoke, and arced through the twilight. It flew for a second, a beautiful, terrible streak of crimson against the deep blue sky, before burying itself in the dense wall of corn. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a single stalk caught fire. Then another, and then the fire didn't just catch, it exploded. A low foam sound, and a wall of orange flame erupted from the field, roaring 20 feet into the air. The dry stalks burned with an unholy speed, the fire spreading sideways with a sound like 1,000 angry hornets. The sudden, blinding light and the wave of heat made the Millers flinch back. For one crucial second, they were silhouetted against a raging inferno, their faces momentarily stunned, their eyes blinded by the glare. Mr. Miller raised an arm to shield his face. Mrs. Miller's humming stopped. Even Samuel took a stumbling step backward. It was my only chance. It was the only one I would ever get. I didn't grab anything, not my laptop, not my research, not the soil samples. Not even the keys. I just ran. I launched myself out of the van's passenger door, away from the Millers, away from the fire. I hit the ground, stumbled, and found my footing. Then I plunged headfirst into the darkness on the other side of the farmstead, into the silent, waiting maze of the unburnt corn. The stalks whipped at my face, leaves like paper razors. The ground was uneven, and I nearly twisted my ankle a dozen times. Behind me, the roar of the fire grew louder, a hungry beast I had just unleashed. The orange glow pulsed against the night sky, casting flickering, monstrous shadows that danced and leapt between the rows. It was the only light I had. I just kept running, deeper and deeper into the endless green and gold ocean, with the sound of my own ragged breath and the crackle of the flames chasing me into the night. I didn't dare look back. I just ran. The corn was a physical thing, a solid wall of sharp leaves and thick stalks that tore at my clothes and whipped across my face, leaving stinging red lines on my cheeks and arms. The ground beneath my feet was a chaotic mess of furrows and loose soil, and my ankles screamed with every other step, threatening to give out. But I couldn't stop. To stop was to die. Behind me, the world was on fire. The roar of the flames was a living thing, a hungry beast I had unleashed. It swallowed every other sound, except for the frantic, ragged rasp of my own breathing. I swore I heard a scream once, a high-pitched shriek carried on the hot wind, but it was cut off so quickly I couldn't be sure if it was Mrs. Miller or just the fire finding a pocket of sap in a green stalk. It didn't matter. I forced the sound from my mind. I couldn't afford to think of them as people anymore. They were a force of nature, like a flood or a blight. And the fire was my only answer to them. The orange glow was my only light. It pulsed against the night sky, casting my shadow long and grotesquely thin, a dancing stick figure fleeing between the rows. The shadows of the cornstalks themselves were worse, leaping and twisting like skeletal fingers reaching for me. Every rustle of leaves that wasn't caused by my own passage was a member of the Miller family. Every snap of a dry twig under my boot was the sound of a shovel handle breaking. My mind was a mess, a raw bundle of panic and adrenaline. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes, maybe an hour. Time had lost all meaning. There was only the burn in my lungs, the stitch in my side, and the desperate, repetitive command in my head. Keep going, don't stop, keep going. The rows of corn seemed infinite, a maze designed by a mad god. I was getting lost, I knew it, but getting lost was better than being found. Then, something changed. The ground under my feet became harder, more even. The stalks thinned out, and then I burst through the last row and collapsed, tumbling onto something hard and gritty. Gravel, I gasped, rolling onto my back and staring up at the anemic, pre-dawn sky. I was on a road, a small, unpaved farm road, but it was a road. It was a line drawn in the dirt, a sign that the world existed beyond that single, cursed farm. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, my body trembling with exhaustion. Far behind me, a pillar of black smoke smeared the horizon, the orange glow at its base now just a dull, angry pulse. It was over. I had made it. I must have laid there for a long time, the cold of the gravel seeping into my back. I was listening to the silence, a silence so complete it felt louder than the fire. No humming, no footsteps, just the whisper of the wind. Eventually, the distant rumble of an engine grew louder. Headlights cut through the gloom, pinning me in their beams. A semi-truck slowed to a halt, its air brakes hissing like a giant, tired snake. The driver's door opened and a silhouette of a large man leaned out. "Jesus Christ, son, you all right? What in God's name happened back there?" I tried to answer, but all that came out was a dry, choked sob. I couldn't form words. He must have seen the blood, the terror in my eyes. He didn't ask another question. He just climbed down, helped me to my feet, and guided me into the warm cab. The smell of stale coffee and cigarettes was the most wonderful thing I had ever smelled in my life. He radioed for help. The police and an ambulance met us at the next interchange. I remember bits and pieces after that. A warm blanket, a paramedic checking my pupils, a state trooper with a notepad, his face a mask of professional concern as I tried, and failed, to explain what happened in a way that didn't sound completely insane. "A fungus," I kept saying. They were feeding it. He just nodded and wrote it down, his expression never changing. The next 3 weeks were a blur of hospital checks, interviews, and the suffocating comfort of my small city apartment. The company put me on paid leave, of course. They were very supportive, very concerned, but I could feel the distance in their voices over the phone. A scientist who burns down his own research site. A man who makes wild accusations about human sacrifice and killer soil. I was a problem, a liability wrapped in a trauma blanket. But in my apartment, hundreds of miles from those golden fields, I started to believe I was safe. The nightmares were bad, full of humming and the clean, curved blade of the sickle, but they were just nightmares. During the day, the sounds of the city, sirens, traffic, the neighbors arguing through the thin walls, were a comfort. They were the sounds of a world that operated on logic, a world where the earth didn't get hungry. I saw a therapist. I started sleeping a little better. I almost felt normal again. That's when the email arrived. It was from Dr. Ames, the head of my department. The subject line was bland, corporate, final report, field site 734. My heart gave a little jolt. I had almost forgotten. Before I fled the van, before everything went to hell, I had sealed and shipped the first day's soil and plant root samples via a priority courier. It was standard procedure. I clicked open the attached PDF. The report was dense, filled with the clinical, detached language of science that I used to find so reassuring. Report summary: analysis of soil and plant matter from Site 734, Miller Farm, IA, reveals the presence of a previously uncatalogued symbiotic fungal parasite, provisionally designated Geophaga agrestes. The organism displays an unprecedented capacity for genetic fusion with its host plant, Z. maize. I scrolled down, my eyes scanning the technical data. The parasite appears to fundamentally alter the host's root system, restructuring cellular tissue into a fibrous, myosin-like matrix capable of absorbing and processing complex organic compounds far beyond the normal capacity of plant life. Soil analysis corroborates this, with anomalous spikes in iron, protein, and hemoglobin traces consistent with. The report went on, but I knew what it was going to say. It was a confirmation of my worst fears. But it was still just a report. It was about them, about that place. I was here, I was safe. Further analysis of the fungal spores reveals a sophisticated mechanism for host manipulation, not limited to plant life. When inhaled by a mammalian host, G. agrestes spores can cross the blood-brain barrier. The organism appears to target the limbic system and prefrontal cortex, systematically degrading higher reasoning and stimulating primitive territorial and predatory instincts. The primary behavioral drive becomes the feeding and propagation of the fungus within its native soil. It creates, for lack of a better term, a profound and unshakable hunger on behalf of the land. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I kept reading, my breath held tight in my chest. It was the final section, a single paragraph under the heading Contamination Protocol and Advisory, that made the world stop. The spores are highly transmissible via airborne vectors. We have detected trace contamination across all interior surfaces of the shipping container you sent. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the hardwood floor. The screen stayed lit, the final sentence glowing in the dim light of my living room. I didn't pick it up. My gaze was fixed on nothing. The distant sound of a car horn felt like it was coming from a million miles away, from another planet. Trace contamination, on the box I handled. The box I taped up in my van. The box I carried to the courier depot. Without thinking, my right hand came up to my left forearm. An itch, a dull, persistent itch that had been bothering me for a few days, spreading from a small red patch near my elbow. I had dismissed it as a rash, stress-induced eczema. Now, I looked at it. It wasn't just a patch anymore. It was a faint, web-like pattern of red lines under the skin, barely visible. I stared at the pattern, a map of something terrible and new. From my lips, a sound escaped. It was quiet, almost inaudible. A low, tuneless breath of a melody. A hum. It had no beginning and no end, a mindless, persistent sound. And as I listened to the alien sound coming from my own throat, I recognized the tune. It was the same one Mrs. Miller had been humming as she walked out onto the porch to welcome the planting season.